Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CRA-W Virtual Undergraduate Town Hall. Today we have a topic that's really exciting, enabling science breakthroughs using computer science. Directly after the webinar, we're going to be hosting a chat forum for audience members to discuss with one another about science breakthroughs and leadership opportunities. Our speaker, Deb Agarwal, will join the chat forum for the first 30 minutes. So please remember, don't log off immediately when the webinar ends. Wait until the presentation is complete, and the WebEx platform will automatically change into a chat forum to allow all of you to participate. We're going to start today's webinar with a poll question. We'd like to hear from you about what you think a researcher actually does. You should see the poll open on the bottom right of your screen, and we'd like you to let us know what you think a researcher does. You can select from 4 answers: that they might be sitting in a room thinking deep thoughts, or doing internet searches, or reading papers, or trying to solve previously unsolved challenges. If you'd like to provide us with a different kind of answer, maybe you don't like any of those, feel free to submit what you think using the Q&A box. We're going to give you about a half a minute to answer, and while you're typing your answer, we're going to go through some logistic information. If at any point you have trouble, please submit a response to the Q&A section, and one of our staff members will be there to assist you. So as many of you are starting to join us, maybe individually, maybe as a class, maybe as an ACM chapter, we want to let you know that the webinar is interactive, and it does require responses and input from you. We want to hear your questions, your comments, and your answers to our poll questions. In order to join in these interactive activities, we encourage you to join via your computer or use your cell phone or tablet via the WebEx app. If you have any questions about how to download or set up the app, feel free to submit your questions, and a WebEx staff member will be there to assist you. We also want to mention that at the beginning, we'll have right now that we're going to have an evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you took the time to fill out the feedback survey. The honest feedback that you provide us, we've been using to try and make these webinars much more effective for you, so we would really like to hear what you think. If at any time you have a question that comes up to you, please feel free to send us the question at any point in the presentation. You don't have to wait until we pause for a Q&A section. Your questions will either be answered by our speaker during our live Q&A session or throughout the session as a private response. As you can see from the slide on the screen, there's a Q&A box available usually on the right-hand side of your window where you can submit the questions, and the speaker will then be able to view them. As hopefully you already saw, we will also be having polls that come up during the presentation. Right now, there's the open-ended poll about what a researcher might do that you have available for you to answer. Please take the time to answer it and keep it short and sweet. But throughout the presentation, you're going to see other poll questions come up for you to answer. And it'll really help us make the presentation more directly oriented at you if you're able to participate, give us some answers, so that we can then incorporate that into the presentation as it proceeds. And every time you answer a poll, at the end of the poll, you'll be able to see the results once the poll closes. So if you happen to join us a little bit late, we have this poll question currently active in the bottom right hand of your screen. Think about what you think a researcher does and take a few seconds to answer. As we mentioned before, if you don't like any of those particular answers, you're welcome to enter something into the Q&A box as a response so that we can think about how you're thinking about research and what it involves. So the poll is going to be now closing soon. Responses should appear within 10 to 15 seconds after the poll closes. And so we'll be seeing responses come up that our speaker is going to start with at the beginning of her presentation. So my name's Gail Murphy. I'm the host of today's town hall. I'm calling in from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm a professor of computer science and currently also the Associate Vice President Research and International Pro Tem. My current research focuses on software engineering. I'm really interested in making software developers work more effectively, as well as improving the productivity of all knowledge workers. I'm also a CRA-W board member, and I'm happy with Lori Pollock to be co-organizing these town hall events. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you today Deb Agarwal. She is the Data Science and Technology Department Head at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Dr. Agarwal's research focuses on scientific tools which enable the sharing of scientific experiments, advanced network infrastructure to support the sharing of scientific data, data analysis to support infrastructure for ecoscience, and cybersecurity infrastructure to secure collaborative environments. So right now I'd really like to turn it over to Deb and let her get on with the topic of the day.
Thanks, Gail. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to go with a yes, except for I don't seem to have control yet. Now I do. Let's see. So the subject of my talk is really thinking about computer science in a different way than you traditionally hear about computer science. And since first and foremost, I think of myself as a researcher, I wanted to understand how you think of yourselves in terms of research and what you think that means to you. And I see that most of you have picked the same answer that I did. And so that's good, because I was kind of curious to see how people thought about it, because I remember when I was in school, when we talked about doing research, it was really much more about learning about things that already existed and just spending time understanding those. And that is a core part of research. But the other part of research is really then taking that knowledge and expanding beyond those boundaries. And so in traditional computer science research, what you're trying to do is expand the boundaries of computer science. What we're trying to do in my work here at Berkeley is really think about how do you apply computer science in science to enable breakthroughs. And that requires computer science research as well. And I'm going to talk about what that requires and sorry about that. That should shut that up, sorry. Okay, maybe not. Okay, now it will. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's get on through. And since most of you guessed the answer, you know, if you look at Merriam-Webster, what you see is the simple definition of research really is careful study, but it's also looking for new knowledge about something, right? And so the way I think about it is then this second bullet, a person performing research to solve a problem that has not been solved before is a researcher. And that research really is about trying to understand how to solve a problem that problem that hasn't been solved. So does that make sense to everybody? Actually, I guess you can't answer. So I'm going to assume it does. So I have another question, another poll that I'd like you to answer, because I work at what's called a national laboratory. In my case, it's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And I'd like to get a chance to find out what you think a national laboratory is, because they're fairly little known, and I often encounter lots of different ideas of what is a national laboratory. And so it's really helpful to me to understand how you think of national laboratories. So if you could answer this poll, which you should see now on your screen, that would be fantastic. So I'm gonna talk a little bit and give you a chance to do that. So if you think about a national laboratory, what you want to understand, oh, should I read off the questions? I guess, no, you guys can see the questions, so I'm going to not read off the questions. So let me give you a little history about Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory while you're answering, and I think we can probably close the poll fairly soon here. And basically what happened with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. It's the first of the national laboratories, at least within Department of Energy. And what happened is that Ernest Orlando Lawrence was studying particles, and he was trying to understand how particles worked. And he realized that he needed a much bigger team of people to help him. And so he went to Congress and he asked for, what he asked for really was a chance to have a place where he could bring together people of different disciplines. Okay, so you mostly know what a national laboratory is. Cool. And so this next slide is a picture from after Congress agreed that he needed a national laboratory. This is actually a picture of his team. And one of the things that you'll, if you knew all the names of all the people, what you'd see is a very multidisciplinary team from across physics and engineering and materials science and chemistry and all the disciplines he needed, machine shop people, programmers, in order to build the sort of cyclotrons that he wanted to build, right? Because he was looking at particles, so he was trying to build cyclotrons. So in 1931 is when this first national laboratory was built, and you all have guessed correctly that basically it is a national laboratory is a U.S. government-run scientific research institution. It's also a place where cross-disciplinary research goes on. So in fact, you all got this question right. And so now let's talk about what we do at a national lab. So I have to put in the picture because the other really cool thing, I shut my blinds, but the reason I shut my blinds is because I look like it had a big halo. The view out my window is pretty close to the view that you see there in the picture. So we're actually just up above the UC Berkeley campus, and we look out over the San Francisco Bay. So working at a national lab also doesn't mean you have to be out in the middle of nowhere. There are actually, a lot of them are in pretty cool places. And there's actually a large number of national laboratories. There's not just the Department of Energy national labs, but there's actually national labs for other agencies as well within the government. Okay, so I have one more question for you. Actually, I have a few more questions, but this is the next one. So one of the things that I said we do is work on science. So I'd like you to go ahead and answer this question, because what I'd like to understand is, what do you think are the critical challenges facing the world today? And granted, I only gave you a subset of the possible choices, but you can obviously write in choices just as you did for the other polls. And what I'm trying to understand is what you think are the critical issues, and you're going to have to pick your top choice. And the reason why we're doing this is because what we do at the National Laboratory is really go after solving key science challenges. And so typically those science challenges are challenges that the world is facing today. And so I put some of them on this poll. I mean, some that I left out are things like, the fuel aspect, right? So at what point do we run out of oil and things like that? I chose a particular set. So Gail, I'd like to actually engage you and ask you what you think out of these questions. Which one would you have chosen, or would you choose?
There's a lot of great answers there. I would go with climate change.
Okay. Oh, all right. So a large number of you went with climate change. Looks like about 20% on extreme storms and water shortage and food shortage. Okay, great. Nobody thinks that spontaneous cell phone fires. Come on, with the galaxy. Sorry, I had to do it. So, in fact, when you think about almost all of my core science is thinking about climate change. And the reason why is because, in fact, the other three that are in there, and many other key challenges, have a lot to do with climate change. And if we don't understand climate change, then there's the problem that we don't necessarily understand how to solve any of the other three and what would happen in terms of the other three. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these, and I'll bring in some of how these other ones actually come into play on it. So our mission at at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is really to try to solve these pressing and profound science challenges facing humankind, right? So secure energy future. So security that we have energy, you know, be it alternative energy or be it fossil fuels. Understanding our systems around us, because if we don't understand them, we can't predict what will happen in the future. And understanding really matter and the energy and the universe itself, right? So these are things like dark energy, they're, you know, basic physics, they're basic material science, things like that, which help us to do the engineering and to think about how do we solve some of these challenges and what are the available tools to do it. Another key thing that we do, and actually I'm hoping all of you will consider this sometime in your schooling or after, is that there's a lot of opportunities to intern with the National Lab. And so I would seriously consider it. It's a nice chance to get involved in science. All right, so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about a few of the facilities we have at the lab. At the laboratory, we have about 7 national user facilities that are actually available globally. So this one that I have a picture of is called the Advanced Light Source. It's a particle accelerator. It produces very high brightness X-ray beams. So what does that mean? You know, you've gotten an X-ray. I mean, I actually have a broken arm, so I've gotten an X-ray recently. This is an X-ray machine that can show you things at the atomic scale. So, you know, it's been used for everything from, like when the space shuttle blew up, when the Columbia Space Shuttle blew up, they sent some of the parts to the particle accelerator to actually get a view inside the materials of where the failures had occurred and what they look like. Things like that. There's biological ones where they're looking at a living organism and X-raying it at the atomic scale to look at very small organisms, look at genetic type activities, things like that. The crystallography of, you know, so the crystal structure of materials, whole range of things like that. So another facility that we have is focused on energy efficiency, which you don't think of straight off when you think about how do we solve the energy crisis. You think mostly about the alternative fuels, the you know, how to create power out of alternate methods. But reality is one of the largest fuel savings that we can make is through energy efficiency. And so this happens to be a picture of the Windows lab that they have, and this is something they've been doing for over 20 years, is looking at how do you change the way we construct buildings to be much more efficient? And how do we make it so that, in fact, the efficiency of the building is so good that the use of the sunlight as it comes in, the use of the natural heating you get from the solar or from the ground, other things like that, how do we make it as efficient as possible? So I want to sort of transition into why does computer science matter to all these questions? And there's many more facilities, but those give you some feel for some of the types of facilities we have. And what's happened over the many hundreds of years now is that, you know, we've really moved through in science to more and more sophisticated methods of looking at the things we want to observe around us, the things that we want to understand around us, right? So originally everything was empirical, right? This is some version of Galileo with his telescope. And, you know, and then over the last couple of hundred years, there's been a real theoretical branch that's been developed that starts to try to do prediction. Because once you have a model of what's happening, you can start to run it forward and enable prediction. And in the last few decades, what's happened then is that those models have become so complex that you need a computational capability. And the thing that's happened even more recently is that we've reached this point where the detectors that we're using in telescopes, the detectors we're using in things like the Advanced Light Source that I showed you a picture of, in the different particle accelerators that around the world, things like the CERN one in Switzerland, but also the observed information that we have in the system from, like in the climate space, there's a lot of observations, right? There's satellites that we fly around the world. Excuse me, I've got a cold. But luckily on a virtual town hall, it's not catchable. So basically, though, what we're seeing is a huge amount of data. And you typically hear in the news about the data deluge in the corporate world, in the places where there's commercial need, the financial need, the transactional information about cookies and milk and things like that, and diapers. But the same sort of issues are happening in science, where the amounts of data generated are exceedingly large, and it's no longer possible to just pull up a spreadsheet and do an analysis of it. And so really we've seen an emergence of science really needing to have new data exploration tools. And so my department really focuses on that. And so now I'm gonna sort of drill into the computer science aspect a little bit more, right? So what does computing have to do with science, right? I mean, typically when you think about going into science, you think about going into biology or astronomy or physics or one of these base sciences. What I do instead is in computer science, I actually have gone into all of them because all of these science fields are now reaching this point where, in fact, they need the computer scientists to help them. So if you look at, so the climate model is trying to take a model of what's happening. The original climate model was just looking at what's happening in the clouds and the atmosphere, and just trying to be able to get an accurate model of what's happening and then be able to predict forward, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, what's going to happen. And over time, that climate model has gotten more and more complex. They've added more and more processes. You know, how does carbon exchange with the ground? What are the plants doing? What are people doing? What are all the emissions from things like power plants, et cetera? And you know, we're now at a point where the climate model generates, you know, on just a couple of runs, 140 terabytes of data. And we're looking at that in the next generation climate model. You know, when you hear about the United Nations climate report, I mean, this climate model, there's a set of climate models that run behind that. And the next run of those will be petabytes of data because they've added so many processes into what they're modeling to try and get as much accuracy as they can, because the more accurate you are, the more you'll be able to predict forward. Because if you're not accurate, then as you predict forward, you become more and more uncertain about your predictions. The better you have that accuracy, the better you can start to predict forward. And so, but this, you know, as I said, this is happening throughout the sciences. Another great example of where the data size has really gotten large is the LSST telescope, which is going to come online in the next several years. That'll have the largest digital camera ever constructed. It's a 3.2 gigapixel camera that takes a picture twice a second, right? So, well, no wait, 3.2 gigapixels every 2 seconds. So basically, what you're looking at is that now image analysis is going to have to deal with the 3.2 gigapixels, and typically those images are a stack of images. You're already seeing that at the Advanced Light Source, where they're taking actually a 3D stack of images and not just a single image. And so it starts requiring computing. So here's another example. The project is called KBase, but what they're trying to do is actually create the biologist workbench. The biologists now have all these different pieces, right? They have genomics that's come online. They have lots of information about organisms and how organisms function, what gene components relate to different organism function, how different organisms interact, all these different pieces. And in a traditional world, they each stayed in their own space. of what they were looking at. One person's looking at germs, one person's looking at the genomics, one person's looking at gene function, different things like that. But now the challenge is really to look across those things, and you need a system where you can really bring that data and the analytics together into one place so that you can really start to manipulate things and ask the questions that you want to be able to ask. And KBase is an experiment in trying to build that space. And so it's a huge computer science team working with the biologists to think about, how do you do that? How do we enable you to think about this space where you're bringing together all this disparate data and enabling you to actually look across these different questions and be able to answer them? So I'm gonna now flip to just solely talking about my project, since that'll allow me to get a little more personal in the details of some of these. And so one of them is a project that we did, it's now 5 or 6 years ago, but I think it's really relevant to showing you sort of the importance of climate change. And that's at the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is it's a national service with offices in each of the different regions. So the Northern California region, one of their most pressing questions is, how do we recover salmon? How do we get salmon back into the rivers and breeding in Northern California? They were very plentiful before. How do we get them back? So they have a pot of money to actually work on that problem, and they can do recovery efforts on streams. But their core underlying question is that it's not enough to just look at, oh, well, there used to be salmon in the stream, so if I recover the conditions to similar to what they used to be, salmon will return. Because reality is, with climate change occurring, the question also is, but will the climate of that river change so much that even if I restore it to its current amount of shade and amount of gravel and depth and width and things like that, that the salmon still would not return because conditions still don't match what they would like? Right? So you have to be able to look at something like climate change to understand even how you can approach food, right? Same thing happens with crops. Because you can't assume you can still grow the exact same crop in the exact same place with the exact same results if the climate is changing underneath you, and the conditions will be different at the new location, or at the same location. So actually, well, let me pause and say a little bit about what we did there. So what we needed to do there is that they were flying pretty much blind. They had some information about where salmon used to be. They knew where all the creeks were. They'd walked the creeks. They knew which ones were close enough to wild that they actually thought they could recover them. But what they didn't have is the ability to pull together all the data to look longitudinally over time at how things were changing in terms of the weather conditions, the stream conditions, et cetera. And so what we did is we built them a data mining structure that allowed them to have all of the streams of Northern California, all the information about precipitation and rain and the balance of water flow within each watershed in Northern California, so that they could put that together with their fish information, the climate change information, and understand the stream's characteristics. So another project that I've been working on for about 10 years, and one of the things you'll notice in a typical computer science project, we come in and we do something for about a year, maybe 3 years is a really long project in computer science because the technology has changed in the meantime. The difference with the scientists is they go out and they're studying very long-term activities. And so they're looking longitudinally over time for 10s and 20s and hundreds of years at these processes and understanding and observing them. And so basically, one of the things you're going to hear from me is also, groups where I've worked with them for 10, 20 years. And it's because we're evolving, we're helping them to evolve. And it's not a one-time thing. We're not just evolving them, now you're on the new system, you can do better data. But we're actually bringing them along each step of the way because their data is exponentially increasing, just as every other, most other domains. So this one is looking at carbon flux. And so I mentioned that on the climate model, you want to get more accurate about what's going on. But one of the key questions is understanding how carbon is exchanged between the plants and the atmosphere. Right? So the plants, the soil, all of what's on the ground, and the atmosphere, right? So you want to understand how CO2, methane, the different carbon gases are being exchanged, because if you're going to improve the climate model and its representation of the carbon cycle, you need ground truth that can tell you what actually happens when it rains more, when you have a drought, when you have fir trees, when you have deciduous trees, if you're in a northern latitude or a southern latitude. And so we've been working with a group called Flux, where there's about 130 different people who are all measuring carbon flux. And the pictures to the left are the types of setups that they use to do these measurements. They're very complex measurements that they do to try to understand this. And it's 130 different groups. We then run the central site that brings all this data together, processes it in one common framework, and then provides that out to people to use to look at for the climate models, to understand properties about what happens with a drought. I mean, one of the naive questions that I had, when I thought about this from my high school biology background, because that's as far as I went in biology, is that, if I think about it, I think, well, plants uptake carbon, right? I mean, that's how they grow. And so if we have warmer springs and longer summers, then the plants should just grow bigger and more green, right? So this might actually be good for the plants that in fact we're having this global warming. I mean, maybe everybody just gets greener. And so, but what you have to do, and the scientists have slowly, shown me, is that reality is you have to understand that whole cycle throughout the year and throughout different conditions to really understand what's going to happen. And what actually happens in the end is that, yes, the plants get green earlier in the year because spring came earlier, but also the leaves fall off earlier. And so you get more decay before the snow comes. And so in fact, it's not necessarily that you're getting more uptake of carbon out of the atmosphere, because you're also getting this additional decay going on. So this is an attempt to understand that. We're also working with, so we're also working with globally a group, and that's about 500 different sites, and bringing that data together. So that's a global system, and we just put out a data set from across those sites. And so another one is really thinking about the watershed. So this was that water resources aspect, because we need to understand, based on what's happening in the climate, how is that going to change how the watersheds operate, right? So we want to understand, will the watershed stay the same? Will it, how will it function differently in a changing climate? The way we do that is by studying when we have droughts and when we have unusually wet winters. We can look at what happens in those particular microcosms of that year and start to then look at how do we apply that. Okay, so one more project that's a little bit less obvious from the climate science standpoint, but it really matters. If you look at all of our power plants, in particular the coal-fired power plants, but also the natural gas-fired power plants, they put out a lot of carbon, right? And so one of the questions is, can we change the way that they operate such that that carbon, and CO2 particularly, is captured before it goes out the smokestacks and used in some beneficial way? So we actually have a project that's looking at how do we design the computational system that would enable the designers of these systems to design the system using computational tools and speed up the development such that we can get these sort of devices that are required to do this carbon capture to the market much sooner than would otherwise occur. So that's really the technical part. Are there questions that have come up so far that we should answer now before I go on to talk a little bit more about what my work is like? And then on to the leadership section. Gail?
Hey, Deb, that was super interesting so far. I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot. And it's such a wide range of projects. I mean, one of the questions that has come up is how much science do you actually have to know to be helpful to the scientists in these projects?
That is a fantastic question. That is, so what's really great about this is I've always loved science, and I've always loved understanding science, but I chose computer science to go into. And I only have mostly a high school education and a little bit of college education in most of these sciences. What happens, though, is these scientists are desperate for help because they're at a point where they can no longer do their science without the help of computer science. So the beauty is I have Nobel laureates who are willing to teach me their science and exactly how they do it and answer any question I want, just if I will help them. And so it's amazing because I learn, I don't come in knowing the science. I immerse myself in the science as I work on a project, and I learn the science from the people who are practitioners, because I'm not coming in as a junior person in their field. I'm coming in as someone who can help them. And so they spend a great deal of effort teaching us their science so that we can truly help them.
That's really great. I mean, I know one of the reasons I became a computer scientist was I didn't have to choose what I was going to do. The projects could always change, and I think you really captured that. What's kind of the hardest technical challenge that you've had to tackle from a computer science point of view on these projects?
You're going to get a disappointing answer, because the hardest technical challenge is really understanding what the scientists need. Because typically they're going to have a difficult time translating it into computer science to explain to us what they need to be able to do. And so one of the most difficult challenges that we've faced is really thinking about how do we change our conversation? Because we used to go in and say, what's your machine learning problem? Or what's your visualization problem that we can help you with, right? And typically we built things that were marginally helpful to them, but rarely life-changing for them. And what we've done is we've actually taken HCI techniques and incorporated them into how we engage, and it's allowed us to really think about what's the problem and how do we solve it.
Sounds really collaborative then. I do want to remind everybody that they can type questions in, and even if we don't have time in this session online, we'll make sure they get answered afterwards. So here's one more question. Is there certain major tools that you use to be able to help in all these different scientific fields?
So yes, but the biggest tool you use is your brain. and really being able to work between the disciplines and think about the discipline and the computer science at the same time, and find the best tool for the job. So often the tool, with moderate scale problems is a database. And now looking at these evolving definitions of what is a database, where we're moving to HDF5 as the space where the data is stored instead in file structures, and then with advanced indexing techniques, so that you turn the entire file store into a database, in effect, instead of having to read everything into the database. That's becoming a very common paradigm. Machine learning is definitely starting to get more and more prevalent to understand things. A great example is in the case of understanding extreme storms. You're trying to look within the climate model results for these storms to see whether they're bigger or more frequent or how they change in the prediction. And the way you have to look is you're looking at grid nodes where each one has just wind and direction and things, and you have to put the thing together into a hurricane, right? And the way you do that is machine learning. So I'd say those are two of the major tools.
Sounds like you really get to exercise your brain every day. I do want to move on to sort of the mentoring topic because you have so much interesting stuff to say on that as well. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your career and what you've learned about mentoring and leadership.
Okay, so I first want to also, one of the reasons why I didn't originally, so this this is how much I've traveled for work. And so don't think that a computer scientist just sits at a desk and never leaves the office. This is just my work travel. And this was just sort of the ones I could think of off the top of my head. It really is an opportunity to get out and around and work with people from all over. Okay, so Gail, did you want to talk about the Q&A box?
No, I think people have a hang of it. I think we can move on.
Okay. All right. So before I spend too much time on mentoring and leadership, I first want to ground you in where do I come from. Okay. So my career path. When I first thought about what I wanted to be, I loved to sail, I swam, I did everything there was to do on the water. I thought Jacques Cousteau was the coolest person on the entire planet. I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. Luckily, he's been slightly famous recently, so you may actually have heard of him, but he was, when, you know, he had a show where he was an oceanographer and he'd go study these amazing things out in the ocean. And I thought, oh my God, that is the coolest thing ever. What happened is my dad bought me a book on oceanography, and I learned that most of oceanography was sitting on a little boat eating fish and occasionally going out doing something really amazing out in the water. So instead, I went into mechanical engineering. That's a picture of Purdue University, if any of you are from Purdue. I went to Purdue for my bachelor's. I then went out and worked as a mechanical engineer at General Motors. This is a picture of the General Motors Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. And I worked there for a while doing robotics. And a lot of why I'd gone into mechanical engineering is because the last thing I wanted to do was sit behind a desk and type on a keyboard. And to me, computer science, that's what it was going to be. And when I got to General Motors, they were just starting to flip. Sorry, I'm going to show my age. They were really just starting to flip to changing to using robots for assembly. And so they said, well, we need help being able to program the robot before we put it on the floor, because we can't afford all the days of downtime to program the robots if we wait until we bring it into the assembly line. And so what did I end up doing? I ended up behind a computer's terminal programming robots. But I loved it. So when I went back to graduate school, I went to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, and I started in mechanical engineering, but I very quickly switched to computer science and computer engineering. And so I did my master's and PhD in that. I then actually took a job with Berkeley Lab. My original plan had been to be a professor. The reason why I picked the lab is it was going to be an opportunity to really establish my research career without some of the other constraints you have in a university environment. The other reason is because it just sounded so cool to work with the scientists. And they had a project up at the Advanced Light Source that just sounded amazing, and I wanted to try it. And one of the really neat things that I've been able to do during my career is do a lot of international travel, as I already mentioned. This one is actually the UN in Vienna. And I went there to help with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization to be a consultant. And that was about a total of 5 months over 3 years that I lived in Vienna. This is actually Rennes, France. I'm actually doing a sabbatical now, where I'm spending a couple of months a year in Rennes working with computer science researchers in France to think about how they can engage more fully with the scientists. And this is my wife. I wanted to just show her as well. So let's jump into the leadership topic. At this point, I've gone through being project lead. I've been a group lead. I'm now a department head. What does that mean? I now lead about 40 to 50 people. They're arranged in 4 groups. And so I work with them to build up our portfolio and data. And so that's sort of my experience in things. And so I think the first thing that I want to do is really, we've got 2 poll questions out here, and I'd really like to get your thoughts on this, because the question often comes up. It's hard to define what is a leader, right? Is it having a position of authority, right? I just told you I'm a department head. I've been a group lead. Is it that sort of position? Is it having the best ideas and being out front? Is it being the person who enables the team and might not be out front, right? And so I'd like you to answer the poll. So it looks like the polls have ended, if I'm correct. Because the other question really is, how do you become a leader? I'd like you to think about, how do you become a leader? And so Gail, do you want to give your answer on this?
Let's see. I would hope that what defines a leader is about being the person to enable the team to succeed. And if becoming a leader requires shouting the loudest, I'm going to have really big problems. So I hope it's gaining trust or one of the other answers.
Okay. So how do you become a leader? What do you think?
How do you become a leader? Gain the trust of a team can be a good way to get assigned, so I guess I would have trouble choosing between those two.
Okay, great. All right.
Looks like we have full answers too, so.
We do, and they look like they match a lot of what you said, and it's a great answer that it's also by getting assigned a leadership position. But I love that you all also came up with the fact that gaining the trust of the team. And I will say that in many respects, and most of my talk is really going to focus on the fact that it's easier actually to gain the trust of the team when you're not in the leadership position. And so actually getting the leadership position too early sometimes can actually make it very difficult to be the leader. So I'm going to talk about some advice that doesn't seem very obvious that it's about leadership, but I want to walk through this because this is really important. And a key part of being a leader is being reliable and building your reputation as someone that people can trust and rely on. And so a key part of that is always doing a good job on the projects you undertake. It may not be a project you love, but if you do a great job, then the people that ask you to do that will become your advocates. And if you're not going to pay attention to the thing and do a good job, don't take it on. If you can afford not to, if you can't afford to skip doing that job, then do a good job at it. Spend the time to pay attention to it and do a good job. It'll build up your advocates. One of the key things in computer science and in any of these science fields is that 6 degrees of separation is way too many. It's more like 2. So people will remember you, and it will pay back, good or bad, depending on which way you went. And so the more that you have people who think well of you, the more it'll pay back on the good side. So in that vein, a key here is that, in the school environment, you're very much taught to take credit and to do things individually because your instructors are trying to evaluate your abilities. And so for many of you, you will have come out of school with very much a training of how to take credit and how to make sure that your contributions are very well known. And what you'll find in leadership is actually sharing credit generously has more benefits than grabbing credit. It's not because you want to give up credit. It's because you share credit, right? So the person who collected the data for the analysis that you did, which then led to the paper, you add that person to the paper, right? They didn't help with the analysis maybe, but your analysis would not have been possible without that data, right? So thinking about who all contributed to that and enabling them to also share in that credit is really a great way to build advocates and to get included in other projects, because when people know that you share credit, they want to share credit with you. So in the same way, it's really easy to think, oh man, I got this award. Why didn't anybody congratulate me? And one of the best things you can do to really have that there's many people around who want to congratulate you is celebrate others' achievements around you. When you hear about something great happening, you have 2 choices. You can say, wow, why wasn't that me? I'll bet I could do that too. I should get that. Let me just work on being that good. And great, sure, do that, but also stop and really congratulate the person who made this achievement and celebrate that with them and help them to feel good about what they did. And they'll come back and celebrate when you get achievements as well. Another really key one is take responsibilities for your failures. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because that's in like every leadership book. That's sort of the pat answer, but it's really true. And a key here, I hadn't thought about this until actually I was running a leadership session and somebody asked me, how do I define leadership? Because I don't tend to think of myself as a leader because I'm not trying to be out front. And so actually my definition of a leader is kind of backwards. It's that when I turn around, if everybody's following me, I'm a leader. And that's turned out to work really well for me because then I'm not trying to be out front. It enables me to put other people out front and let them shine in the sun. And what ends up happening is they recognize that, in fact, that was leadership. And if we have time toward the end, remind me, and I'll tell you a story about that. Because it's how I got my job at Berkeley Lab, was actually touting everyone else's accomplishments. So I already mentioned don't make enemies. Everybody knows everybody in the community. It's a bad idea to make enemies. You do want to learn how to be assertive, and I don't mean by shouting out the loudest or being the most aggressive. There are many things you can do with your body language that assert you into a presence. And one of the great ways to get some of the experience in both assertiveness and communication skills is take a theater class, right? If you think about when you're at the theater, those actors really know how to grab your attention just by walking somewhere, just by standing differently, just by body movements, by arm motions. They can tell you they have something to say without saying a word, right? And those sort of skills give you an opportunity to be assertive without being loud or aggressive. And it's really important. It's really valuable. And you have to, I find many people that I work with, and I do it myself sometimes, if you have this great vision, it seems obvious that everybody else can understand it, and it's just obvious that people should just fall behind this vision. But you have to recognize that if people can't understand your vision, if you don't take the time to help them to come along and understand it and agree with it, they're not going to be inspired to follow it. So you saw the thing about the United Nations, you saw the thing about that I spent time in France. Those were not obvious things that made sense in my career, right? If I look at my career as this nice linear trajectory toward becoming a bigger and bigger, title, bigger and bigger projects, more and more projects, more and more cool things. Well, the more and more cool things maybe are different, but it wouldn't be so obvious to me that taking these serendipitous things like the UN, like the France thing, are anything other than a drag on my career. Reality is they've helped my career tremendously. So take those opportunities and do the things that make life enjoyable, make your job enjoyable. And the key, as you all noticed that, and we talked about in the beginning, learn to lead now. Learn to lead without the power and without the position, because that way when you have the power and the position, it'll be natural to you to lead people. If you have to learn it once you have the position, you can't tell the difference between whether they're following you because they're supposed to or because they believe in you. And it's dramatically different in terms of the results. And so it's much better to have them follow you because you're a good leader and to prove yourself now, because it's low stakes right now, right? It can be anything from, hey, where are we going to dinner today, right? And sort of figuring out, how do I lead the group to come to a decision, the best decision, right? Things like that help you to build your skills at how do I move a group to do the things that make sense for us as a group as the best answer for us together. And I just want to leave it with this, is that, you know, innovate in your career. Don't get stuck in just, I do this, and this is the main thing I do, and I should do this forever because it's how I'm going to stay, you know, really stay focused on my career and advance it. You know, when you see a cool thing, when you see a cool opportunity, when you think that you're headed down the wrong path, innovate in your career, figure out where you should be and what you should be doing. I've been able to do that here within Berkeley Lab. I mean, I reinvent myself all the time in terms of what I'm doing, who we're engaging with, how we're engaging with them, you know, and so please don't be well behaved, right? I mean, think about how you can innovate, how you can really change the game in solving problems, in making your career fun. And you'll find that it's a great opportunity. So I think that was all the slides I have, unless I'm mistaken.
Well, Deb, that is totally awesome advice. I think I'm going to print these out and put them on my wall. Maybe not the one about being misbehaved. Maybe people won't want to see that on my wall, but I'll have to remember that one too. We're getting close to the end here, so I think although we have some great questions, maybe we'll take those during the chat forum that happens at the end, which I know you're going to be staying on for at least part of. So I do want to really thank you for your presentations. They were really awesome. I think really inspiring, as well as to all the great things one can do having a research background in computer science and the opportunities that exist in so many different areas. If you could actually just click to the next slide for me. Actually, two more.
Actually, you're now the presenter.
I'm now the presenter. I have the power. I have the power to do it. Great. I did want to remind all of our attendees that you will be sent a survey. As well, there's a URL up on the screen. We would really, really, really appreciate it. I know often we're all surveyed to death these days, but we really do take this very seriously, and it helps us not only make better presentations, but help make them possible in the first place. So if you get an email pretty soon, we'd really like you to take the time to give us that feedback. As well, the webinar will be posted, a recording of it later that you'll be able to go to the CRA-W.org website and find it. There are also a number of resources that are available on the CRA-W website to get information about other programs other than town halls, to find out about events that you can go to, or maybe just to get into touch with people that can answer your questions that you might have. So don't forget to take our survey. Thanks again to Deb. And I think we'll be moving into a chat forum, so please stay on, and you'll have a chance to ask all your questions and get them answered in that forum as well. Thank you for attending.